right, here's our first definition for glycolysis. Now, we've investigated it in two forms. One, a statement of understanding. One was that worksheet that looked like this, right? Looking at the different reactions. Now, glycolysis is a series of chemical reactions, 9 in fact, as we learned. But in a simple way, it's just glucose becoming two smaller molecules called pyruvate, and along the way, it makes, here's the pyruvate or pyruvic acid, same thing, it's just two different names for it. And they make ATP along the way, right? It's the first of 3 steps that make ATP from glucose. Here in this picture we have image A, which shows glucose and blood cells in a vein or an artery. And we have this picture here showing glucose outside of the cell and some other particles outside the cell. And then you have a transporter protein, and then inside the cell, the internal space of the cell. So outside of the cell, a bunch of glucose, and less glucose inside, and you can see some glucose is going through the transporter protein. In this example right here, if you read this, it says protein transporter sending glucose from blood to cell. So it's saying the glucose going from blood to the cell. In this picture, this is a simplified version of a cell. It says simplified cell showing cytoplasm, which is the fluid inside a cell, the cell membrane right here, which also is represented right here in this picture. That's the cell membrane. And mitochondria, this guy right here. And we've learned a little bit about the mitochondria. We know some of the processes to make ATP happen in the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. All right, your job is to look at each of these pictures and try to put them in the right order. Is it CBA, CAB, BCA, ABC? What is the right order to show how glucose gets into the cell? And then after that, you are going to do a simplified picture in that order. So whatever order you choose for these pictures to show how glucose gets into the cell, draw a simplified picture of that process. And that would be completing number 1. And then it says show glycolysis occurring in a cell. So the drawing you make of this cell, inside you should show a glucose becoming 2-pyruvic acid. And you can symbolize a glucose molecule in any shape or form you want, and same for pyruvic acid, any shape or structure you want. All right, and here it says label the cell based on a cell type you've used a lot this weekend. And here's some examples. It could be a liver cell, eye cells, muscle cell, stomach cell, lung cell, immune cell. So if you're sick right now, your immune cells are probably working pretty well. I'm feeling a little sick. So right now, if I was going to draw this picture of glycolysis happening in a cell, I would show 1 glucose becoming 2-pyruvic acid in immune cells, because those immune cells are working hard in my body and they're needing energy. And this process provides the energy. All right, next slide. Here we have mitochondria. This is our first definition of mitochondria. And mitochondria starts working for our cells to make ATP after glycolysis. So once glucose goes through glycolysis, we end up with this new smaller molecules, 2 of them, called pyruvate or pyruvic acid. Anyways, not important to remember the name, but it's important to remember that the structure of glucose after glycolysis ends up in this smaller form, and it forms 2 of them, even though only one's shown in this picture. And we get ATP from each of the 1 pyruvate. So for each pyruvate produced in glycolysis, we get 2 ATP. So we get a total of 4 ATP from glycolysis. Once this molecule that ends up at the end of glycolysis, it goes right into the mitochondria, and it helps explain how we get 34 out of the total 38 total ATP. So it produces 90%. The mitochondria is responsible for producing 90% of the ATP. So it makes almost all the ATP in our body. All right, so first thing is do a brainstorm web and list and tell me 5 things that come to mind when you think of the mitochondria. The next is how do you think exercise affects the amount of mitochondria in your muscle cells? Mitochondria amount can change based on your lifestyle. How do you think exercise affects the number or amount of mitochondria in your muscle cells? So you generate a hypothesis. Hypothesis equals, again in your notebook, I think this. Watch these 2 YouTube videos. It discusses the mitochondria in the body and also the body using energy and kind of how it looks in muscle cells. They're great videos, and they'll help you add a better understanding and understand how all these chemical reactions in making ATP relate to our lives, our daily life, okay? All right, moving forward. This was an activity that we are doing. This is the Web 2.0 calculator. If you haven't done a calculation, you need to look at any food item and find out the grams of sugar on it, and then you need to go from this to this, do this whole calculation, so you can end up with how many grams of ATP you can make when you start with a certain number of grams of sugar or carbs. If you need help with this, of course, come see me in person and I'll help you calculate this. But if you feel confident in your skills, you just got to do this number to this numerator, then you divide it by the denominator. Then whatever answer number you get here, you multiply it to the numerator here, divide it by the denominator here. Whatever answer you get when you divide it, then you multiply it into the numerator here. So it just goes numerator, divide it. Numerator, multiplication, divide. And then multiply into the numerator again, and divide by the denominator, and that's your answer. That's the pattern. All right, good luck. And again, it's an online calculator because you need to use this right to put in numbers like this, 2.28 times 10 to the 25. These are gigantic numbers. You need this special calculator like the Web 2.0 calculator to get it to work. This page right here, you can print this or use this to do the calculation. This is the Web 2.0 calculator, and it shows you how to write these numbers. Like this is 6 times 10 to the 23rd. This is how you need to type it up into the calculator. It shows you right here. So even though you see this number in the problem here, 6 times 10 to the 23rd, the way you put it in the calculator so the calculator understands is in this form using parentheses. Print this worksheet from the Chapter 9 notes on Google Classroom to do your calculation. But again, you have to look at a food item and get grams of sugar from it. Here is let's bring it back to home, like athletes. And they're burning calories all the time. Calories is a way to measure how much energy is in food. Well, this is a small paragraph talking about how many calories do some basketball players like Kobe Bryant or LeBron James burn in a typical game. So these questions walk you through identifying how many calories are burned. So first task is finding out how many calories are burned by Kobe Bryant in a 40-minute game. Your next task is identifying, according to this article, how much rice would it take to equal the amount of calories he burns in this game, and all that information is in this article. And then you decide, when you find out how much rice equals the number of calories he burns, or how much rice he'd have to eat to burn that many calories in a 40-minute game, you have to decide, does that seem like a lot of food to you? And give 2 reasons why you think it is or isn't. The third task is, do you think your body would burn the same number of calories as LeBron James or Kobe Bryant in a game? Playing the same game, trying as hard, do you think you'd burn the same number of calories, yes or no? All right, and the final thing is summarize the article. So read this article, this small paragraph, and decide what does it say? Say in your own words. What do you remember about it? What do you think was important? And write it in 1 sentence. So a single sentence to summarize this right here. It's an important skill, taking a bunch of information and in your own words, putting it simply and straightforward. What's important to remember from it? All right, here we have another recognition that is chapter 9.3. Here's a scenario. It says you eat food preparing for an awesome Saturday adventure. So think about this idea. Before you go out and hang out with friends or go out and do exercise or do some sports, you eat some food, recognizing you're about to go do that. And then it says connect image 1. Right here, this is image 1, this whole thing. This is a familiar picture. This is image 1. Relate this picture to you eating food before you go out, because this picture represents how food is handled in the body and the point of eating food. This is what this picture is. So relate this picture to your real life when you eat some food before you go do something. And then up to this point, which steps to making ATP haven't been discussed in the notes? That's the second thing you'd write in your notebook. So there's 1 step or 2 steps out of these 3 that we have not talked about yet. What are they? I just want you to identify them. All right, moving forward, here we go. Here's a slide that you need to copy this down in whatever form you can in your notebook, showing food becoming ATP, and this shows glucose through glycolysis making pyruvate, and then that pyruvate goes into the citric acid cycle, and it forms a new structure. We didn't name it. It's okay. Don't worry about it. But it goes through a citric acid cycle and produces some more ATP along the way. So however you want to write these notes, go ahead and do that. If you want to draw the pictures or use words to describe what's happening in the note. But again, it's glucose going through glycolysis, some ATP is released, and through the chemical reactions it forms new molecules called pyruvate. The pyruvate molecule goes through a citric acid cycle, and along the way and through these chemical reactions you see here, it forms a new structure and makes some ATP. All right, in your notebook you're going to write this table down, and you need to write, comparing glycolysis and ATP, how much ATP does glycolysis produce? Remember, there's 2 pyruvates here, even though it only shows 1. So you got to double up. So however many ATP you see here, you got to double it up for this number. And looking at citric acid cycle, how much ATP is produced, you got to double it up because remember there's 2 pyruvate even though it only shows 1. So however many you count for ATP, you got to multiply it by 2 right here. Enzymes refer to any place a chemical reaction is happening. And remember, reactions are represented with arrows. So you count every arrow here, and every arrow is telling you a reaction's happening. And enzymes cause the reaction. So that's how you get your number here for glycolysis and citric acid cycle. Number of reactions, again, are arrows. So count the arrows. You know how many reactions happen in glycolysis. Same for citric acid cycle. And put that number here. Where does it happen in the cell? You got to check your notes. Just in an earlier slide, we said where glycolysis happens, and we said where citric acid cycle happens. Some happen in the mitochondria, some don't. This slide shows you. All right, it says analyze the table, describe any pattern or lack of one that you see between the two processes. And specifically, look at enzymes and look at the number of reactions. And is there a pattern there? Did you find any kind of pattern there or not when you compare the number of enzymes to the number of reactions? And whatever you see, just discuss that. All right, slide 56 gives us a specific definition for citric acid cycle. The citric acid cycle, we don't have special activities to study it. We study glycolysis deeply. Citric acid cycle, it's similar to glycolysis, and it's what happens to make a little more ATP. And as you can see, citric acid cycle happens in the mitochondria. So write the definition. It says number of NADH made. So this is a type of molecule we've never seen before, but it's asking you how many NADHs are made in citric acid cycle. And if you look, they're in blue. So you can see NADH, NADH. Count them all, and that tells you how many NADH are made. This definition tells you that NADH has an important job. It steals electrons and hydrogen atoms from the pyruvate that goes and starts glycolysis. So this is the pyruvate. As the pyruvate goes through, hydrogens and electrons are stolen along the way by this thing called NAD+. And when NAD+ steals that hydrogen, it becomes NADH, as in the hydrogen it's holding on to. It's bonded to the hydrogen, it's took it, right? So we don't know why it's taking the hydrogens. We don't know why electrons are taken, but they have an important role later. It says carbon dioxide is produced. Find in this picture where carbon dioxide is produced. And then it says, think about 4 parts of the body your carbon dioxide will travel through on its way out of the body. Remember, we breathe out carbon dioxide. So citric acid cycle is showing you that carbon dioxide is produced in this process. So you just describe a story of how it's moving through the body along that path. It says, follow these questions and you're going to basically identify which of these have we not seen happen in any of the processes. So between citric acid cycle and glycolysis, which of these have we not seen yet be produced or formed or used, and which have we seen, right? But specifically it wants you to write this in your notebook, this cellular respiration equation, and then circle ones that we've seen so far, used, processed, or formed, okay? There's one here that we have not seen formed yet or been involved at all. There's one here that we have not seen used by the body at all. That's your hint. All right, connect glucose and glycolysis to CO2 produced in this cycle. So think about that. Is there a connection between the glucose that goes through glycolysis and citric acid cycle and the carbon dioxide produced? There's a brain primer. It's brain primer number 38, or slide 38, but it's brain primer number 19. Look back at your brain primer number 19, or just observe this slide in the recording to relate carbon dioxide and glucose. And that'll help you answer number 4. All right, moving forward. All right, next slide is explaining what NAD+ is and a little bit about what it's doing in the citric acid cycle. Again, it's taking stealing electrons or hydrogens from this pyruvate food molecule along the way. What it wants you to do in this task is kind of look and investigate the citric acid cycle a little more. Remember, all the structures here are, it'll tell you what they are here. So red would be oxygen, hydrogen, and just follow along with these questions. It says, which reaction numbers show the food molecule losing hydrogen electrons? That's anywhere that the NAD+ is. So anywhere where you see NAD+ in this process, that's where they're getting stolen. And you have to figure out what reactions it is and this is calling it reaction